Bikers harass a black woman at a gas station, unaware that her son is Snoop Dogg. When he steps in to defend his mother, the course of events changes their fates forever. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over Los Angeles, its rays slicing through the lingering mist as the city slowly came to life. The distant hum of traffic filled the air, a familiar soundtrack to the awakening metropolis. But in Snoop Dogg's neighborhood, there was still a rare moment of peace. A brief pause before the world picked up its pace again. In the driveway of his home, Snoop leaned against his car, casually wiping down the already spotless windshield with a soft cloth. His mother, Beverly Tate, stepped onto the porch, carrying a small cooler and a neatly packed bag. "Don't forget these," she said, her voice warm but firm. Snoop looked up, smiling as he saw her. "I got it, Mama. You sure you're ready for this trip?" Beverly gave him a knowing look. "Boy, I've been ready since the day you were born. You think I can't handle a little road trip?" He chuckled, taking the cooler from her hands and gently placing it in the back of the SUV. The car gleamed under the morning sun, its polished surface reflecting the palm trees lining their street. "You know this isn't just a little trip," he said, closing the trunk. "We'll be out there for a couple of days. Small towns, long roads, nothing like LL." Beverly shrugged. "I grew up in a small town, Calvin. I know how to handle myself." Snoop's smile faded for a moment. "Times are different now, Mama. And not always in a good way." She stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You worry too much. That's what mothers are supposed to do, not sons. You just focus on driving and let me take care of the rest." He nodded, though a sense of unease still lingered. He was proud of his mother's strength, the way she had raised him almost single-handedly after his father left. But he had seen too much in the world to ignore the dangers that still lurked, especially for people like them. The sudden rumble of an engine across the street caught his attention. He looked up and watched as a neighbor backed out of their driveway. His eyes lingered for a moment on the Confederate flag decal on the truck's rear window. A flicker of anger sparked inside him, but he took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. This was supposed to be a peaceful trip. "Let's hit the road," he said, opening the driver's side door. Beverly settled into the passenger seat, adjusting her seatbelt as Snoop turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, smooth and steady, a comforting sound. As they pulled away from the curb, blending into the backdrop of the open road ahead, Beverly reached over and turned on the radio, filling the car with the smooth sounds of old-school R&B. As they drove, the city gradually faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by open roads and rolling hills. The horizon stretched out before them, vast and promising, and Snoop felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders, though he still found himself glancing in the mirror more often than usual. After a while, Beverly broke the silence. "You know, this reminds me of when we used to take the bus across town just to see your grandma. You were so excited every time, like it was the biggest adventure in the world." Snoop smiled at the memory. "I guess I've always liked being on the move. Never wanted to stay in one place too long." Beverly chuckled. "Except now you've got the whole world watching you. No more sneaking around and staying out late without someone noticing." He laughed. "Guess that's true. But I wouldn't trade it for anything." The conversation drifted from memories to the present. Beverly brought up the protests that had been making headlines, the stories of police brutality and racial tension. Snoop listened quietly, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "You ever think about what it would have been like if things hadn't worked out for you?" she asked. He glanced at her. "All the time?" She nodded as if she already knew the answer. "That's why you keep fighting, isn't it? Even when it's hard." He said softly. "Because it's not just about me." They drove in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken thoughts filling the car. The highway stretched on, leading them deeper into unfamiliar territory. By midday, they pulled into a small diner off the highway to grab lunch. The parking lot was half empty, and inside the atmosphere was subdued. Snoop noticed the way some of the patrons looked at them, Not outright hostility, but curiosity mixed with something darker. Beverly ignored the stares and ordered food, chatting briefly with the waitress. Snoop stayed close to her, his eyes scanning the room. He couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't completely belong here. Back on the road, Snoop gripped the steering wheel tighter, his eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror. Beverly tried to lighten the mood by telling stories about Snoop's childhood, but he only half listened. The farther they drove, the more isolated the landscape became. Late in the afternoon, they passed through a small town where the houses looked worn and faded. American flags hung from nearly every porch, some weathered by time, others displayed with pride. Snoop noticed a group of men standing outside a bar. Their leather jackets bore patches, marking them as part of a motorcycle club. Motorcycles were lined up along the curb, and as the car passed, the men's eyes followed them. Their stares weren't just curious. They carried something else. Something colder. Something that made the unease in Snoop's gut tighten. Beverly didn't seem to notice, but Snoop did. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, his knuckles turning white. "You okay?" Beverly asked, sensing the shift in his mood. "Yeah," he said quickly. "Just ready to get where we're going." They drove on, leaving the town behind, but the unease stayed with him. He couldn't explain it, not yet. But something about this trip didn't feel right. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they began looking for a place to stop for the night. Up ahead, Snoop spotted a gas station. It was small, the kind that sat alone on a stretch of highway with flickering neon lights and cracked pavement. "We'll top off the tank and find a motel," he said. Beverly nodded. "Sounds good. I'll grab us some snacks." As he pulled into the station, Snoop immediately noticed the motorcycles parked off to the side, the same kind of bikes he'd seen earlier in town. His stomach tightened. "I'll be quick," Beverly said, stepping out of the car. Snoop watched her walk toward the store, his eyes flicking back to the bikes. The men were inside, he was sure of it. He took a deep breath and stepped out to pump the gas. The sun was nearly gone now, casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. The faint hum of insects mixed with the distant rumble of approaching engines. He tried to shake the feeling, but it wouldn't go away. Then he heard raised voices coming from inside the store. His heart dropped. Without a second thought, he dropped the gas nozzle and ran. The last rays of sunlight bounced off the chrome and leather of the bikes, their faded patches barely visible in the dimming light. The glowing, "Open" sign flickered weakly, adding to the unease settling over the scene. Snoop's eyes darted to the entrance of the store, where his mother had disappeared just moments earlier. He glanced back at the motorcycles, a cold realization settling in his gut. He didn't need to see the patches up close to know what kind of men they belonged to. He'd seen that type before. Swaggering confidence, hard stares, and an unspoken challenge in their demeanor. The sound of voices inside the store yanked him from his thoughts. At first, they were just murmurs. Then, one voice rose above the others, sharp and aggressive. Beverly's. It started as a murmur, indistinct voices blending into the background noise of the convenience store, but then a sharper tone cut through, unmistakable and firm. "Beverly." Snoop's pulse quickened. He left the gas pump running and strode toward the store, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. The door swung open with a faint chime, and the scene inside hit him like a punch to the gut. Beverly stood near the counter, clutching a bottle of water and a bag of chips. 3 men loomed around her, their leather jackets covered in patches. Symbols Snoop recognized now. They weren't just random bikers. They belonged to a gang notorious in rural areas, known for their hostility toward outsiders, especially people of color. One of the men had leaned in too close, his face twisted into a sneer. "You lost, lady?" he asked, his voice thick with disdain. Beverly didn't flinch. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to pay for these and get back to my son." The moment Snoop stepped inside, the energy in the room shifted. All three men turned to look at him. Recognition flickered in their eyes, darkening their expressions. Well, one of them muttered, stepping back slightly, but not enough to break the tension. Look who it is. Big man from the city. Snoop ignored him and focused on Beverly. You okay, Mama? I'm fine, she said, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of relief at his arrival. He stepped closer, placing himself between her and the men. We're leaving, he said, his voice low but firm. One of the bikers chuckled, crossing his arms. Not so fast, he drawled. You think you can just roll up in here and walk out like you own the place? This ain't L.A., boy. People around here don't take kindly to strangers. Snoop felt his muscles tense, but he kept his cool. He'd dealt with worse before, and he wasn't about to let these men rattle him. We don't want any trouble, he said evenly. Just let us pay and go. The tallest of the three stepped forward, close enough for Snoop to smell the alcohol on his breath. Trouble? The man smirked. Nah, man, trouble's already here. Before Snoop could react, the man shoved him backward. Beverly gasped. The cashier behind the counter froze, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. Snoop stumbled but quickly regained his balance. He saw the worry in Beverly's eyes, not for herself, but for him. That fueled his resolve. Don't, Sperspefisessa said softly. But Snoop had already stepped forward. You need to back off, he warned, his voice sharper now. This ain't the time or the place. But the bikers weren't backing down. The one who had shoved him reached for something under his jacket. Maybe a knife. Maybe something worse. Snoop moved fast. He grabbed the biker's wrist and twisted it hard, forcing him to drop whatever he had been reaching for. A metallic clatter echoed through the store as the object hit the tiled floor. A knife. Before Snoop could fully register it, the other two lunged at him. Instinct took over. He dodged the first punch and countered with a quick jab to the stomach, knocking the wind out of one of them. But the second biker grabbed him from behind, locking his arms in a tight grip. Snoop reacted instantly. He threw his weight backward, slamming both of them into a nearby shelf. The impact sent a cascade of snacks and bottled drinks crashing to the ground. A glass display near the register wobbled dangerously, but before it could tip over, Beverly's voice cut through the chaos. Let go of him, she shouted. Snoop saw her out of the corner of his eye. She had stepped back, her face pale but her hands steady as she held up her phone, recording everything. The bikers hesitated. You're all on camera now, Beverly added, her voice sharper. Think real hard about your next move. A flicker of doubt crossed their faces. One of them cursed under his breath and shoved Snoop away before stumbling toward the door. The others followed, throwing one last glare at Beverly as they stormed outside. Snoop exhaled sharply, his heart pounding. His hands were still balled into fists, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He turned to his mother. You okay? I told you I was fine, she replied, lowering the phone, though Snoop noticed the slight tremor in her hands. The cashier, who had been frozen in place, finally found his voice. I called the cops, he stammered. They'll be here soon. Snoop nodded, grateful but wary. He knew how these situations could play out, even with video evidence on their side. Outside, the roar of motorcycles filled the air as the bikers sped off. Snoop stepped toward the glass doors, watching their taillights disappear into the darkening horizon. But he didn't relax. We're not done here, he muttered. Beverly looked at him, her expression a mix of pride and concern. We need to be careful, Calvin. These men, they're not going to let this go. I know, he said, jaw tightening. But neither am I. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the night air. Snoop squared his shoulders. The fight was far from over, and this was just the beginning. The police cars pulled into the parking lot, red and blue lights flashing, their sirens cut off as officers stepped out. hands resting near their belts as they scanned the scene. Snoop instinctively raised his hand slightly, already bracing himself for what might come next. "You the one who called?" one of the officers asked, his gaze shifting between Snoop and Beverly. Beverly stepped forward, still holding her phone. "I did," she said firmly, "and I got the whole thing on video." The officers exchanged glances, their stance relaxing slightly, but Snoop could feel their eyes lingering on him just a little longer than necessary. "We're going to need to see that," the first officer said. Snoop watched as Beverly handed over her phone, pulling up the footage. As they played the video, he saw their expressions change. The initial skepticism faded, replaced by something closer to concern. "It looks like they didn't leave you much of a choice," one officer admitted, glancing back at Snoop. "But we're still going to need statements from both of you." Snoop nodded, though he couldn't shake the unease in his gut. The officers started asking questions, jotting down notes as Beverly and Snoop recounted what had happened. The cashier backed up their story, nervously confirming that the bikers had been the aggressors. "What do we do now?" Beverly asked when they finished. "We'll review the footage, run the plates on those bikes," the officer said. "If they're part of a known gang, we'll be keeping an eye on them." Snoop crossed his arms. "And if they come back?" The officer hesitated. "If they do, call us. But given what just happened, I doubt they'll want that kind of heat." Snoop wasn't so sure. These kinds of men didn't just let things go. The officers wrapped up, promising to keep in touch. As they pulled out of the lot, Beverly turned to her son. "You don't believe them, do you?" Snoop let out a slow breath, glancing back toward the empty road. "I believe this isn't over." Beverly sighed. "Then we better be ready." Snoop nodded. They got back into the car, locking the doors behind them. As he pulled out of the gas station and back onto the highway, Snoop checked the rearview mirror one more time. He had a feeling they weren't done with those bikers, and if they came looking for trouble again, he'd be ready. The next hour passed in a blur of questions, explanations, and paperwork. Snoop detailed everything step by step, careful to emphasize that he had only acted in self-defense. Beverly backed up his account, and the video provided all the evidence they needed. The officers assured them they would investigate the bikers and issue warrants for their arrests. But even with those promises, Snoop couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. When the police finally left, Snoop and Beverly climbed back into the car. The gas tank was full, but neither of them felt ready to hit the road just yet. "You think they'll come back?" Beverly asked, her voice quieter now. Snoop stared out the window, his jaw tight. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not taking any chances." They drove in silence for a while, the tension lingering between them. The highway was darker now, the only lights coming from occasional passing cars and the faint glow of a distant street lamp. The quiet stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Beverly finally broke the silence. "You know, this isn't the first time I've been scared like that," she said, her voice soft but steady. Snoop glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer right away, as if weighing how much to share. Finally, she sighed. "When you were little, we didn't have much. There were times I had to stand up to people just to keep food on the table. I thought those days were behind me." Snoop felt a pang of guilt. "I should have done more to keep you safe back there." "You did plenty," she said firmly. "But this isn't just about us. It's about what people still think they can get away with." He nodded, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "Not anymore." A few miles down the road, they pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside motel. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a dim red glow over the cracked asphalt. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. As Snoop killed the engine, something caught his attention. A dark van was parked near the edge of the lot, its windows tinted, its exterior unmarked. There was nothing overtly suspicious about it, but something about it felt off. "You go on inside," Snoop said, handing Beverly the keys. "I'll be right there." She hesitated but didn't argue, disappearing into the motel lobby. Snoop lingered outside, walking slowly toward the van, pretending to check his phone. The closer he got, the stronger the feeling became. He was being watched. He could feel it in the weight of the air, in the way the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Suddenly, the van's engine roared to life. The tires screeched against the pavement as it peeled out of the lot, disappearing into the night. Snoop watched it go, his chest tight with frustration. When he finally stepped into the motel room, Beverly was waiting, already settled on one of the beds. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he lied, "just making sure." But as he lay down that night, staring at the ceiling, Snoop couldn't sleep. The day's events played over and over in Snoop's mind, each moment sharpening his determination. These bikers weren't just a random group looking for trouble. They had picked him and his mother for a reason, and they weren't going to stop until someone made them. Snoop closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Tomorrow he would start making calls, lawyers, media contacts, activists, whatever it took. This wasn't just about defending himself anymore. This was about sending a message, one that no one could ignore. Morning light crept through the thin curtains of the motel room, casting faint patterns on the worn carpet. Snoop sat at the small desk by the window, his phone pressed to his ear, as he scrolled through messages and news updates. Behind him, Beverly lay on the bed, her breathing steady but shallow, as if, even in sleep, she couldn't fully relax. Snoop hadn't slept much either. The previous day's events looped through his mind. The bikers' snarling faces, the surge of adrenaline, the weight of knowing it wasn't over. He had spent half the night replaying the footage Beverly had recorded, pausing and rewinding, searching for anything they might have missed. Now, as the sun began to rise, he was already making calls. "No, man, I don't care what it takes," he said into the phone, his voice low but urgent. "I need those plates tracked down, that van too, and put the video out there. Everywhere. I want people to see this." The person on the other end said something reassuring, but Snoop didn't relax. He ended the call and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Behind him, Beverly stirred. "Calvin?" He turned to her. "Morning, Mama. You sleep okay?" She sat up slowly, brushing her hair back. "Better than you, by the look of it. You've been up all night, haven't you?" "I had to make some calls," he admitted. "This thing isn't going away. We need to stay ahead of it." Beverly got up and walked over to him, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I know you're trying to protect me," she said softly, "but don't let this eat you up inside. We're still here. We're still safe." "For now," Snoop said, his voice tight. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right." "Oh, what's the plan?" Beverly asked. "The cops said they'd investigate." Snoop replied, "But you know how slow that can be. I'm not waiting around for them to decide whether this is important enough to follow through on." He picked up his phone again, scrolling through his contacts. "I've already got my people spreading the video. We'll make sure everyone sees it. Media, activists, lawyers. And I'm calling in favors to make sure we've got the best legal team ready." Beverly crossed her arms. "And what about us? Do we just keep running while we wait for them to come after us again?" Snoop's jaw tightened. "No, we're not running. Not anymore." By noon, the video had started gaining traction online. Social media exploded with reactions, outrage, support, and the usual wave of trolls trying to discredit them. As they sat in a booth at a nearby diner, Beverly scrolled through the comments. The greasy smell of fried bacon and eggs lingered in the air, but neither of them had much appetite. "Some people still don't believe it," Beverly said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "They're calling it staged." Snoop nodded, unsurprised. "They always do. Doesn't matter what proof you give them." A man at a nearby table kept glancing over. Snoop felt his muscles tense. He didn't know if the man recognized him or if he was just another local sizing up the outsiders. Either way, Snoop didn't like it. When the waitress brought their check, Beverly reached for her purse, but Snoop waved her off and threw some cash on the table. "Let's get out of here." Outside, the heat pressed down on them as they walked to the car. Snoop scanned the parking lot, his eyes lingering on a black SUV parked near the entrance. It wasn't the van from last night, but something about it felt too familiar. They climbed into the car, and Snoop wasted no time pulling out of the lot. Beverly didn't say anything, but he could feel her watching him, sensing his tension. "You think they're following us?" she finally asked. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not taking any chances." They drove in silence for a while, the road stretching out ahead of them. Eventually, Beverly reached over and turned on the radio, trying to break the tension. A news report came on. The footage shows a physical altercation between the well-known rapper and a group of bikers at a gas station, raising questions about racial tensions in rural communities. Snoop turned it off. "We already know what happened." Beverly frowned. "People need to hear it. They need to know what's still going on out here." "They may will," Snoop said, "but not like this. I'm not letting them turn this into just another story. We're going to do this the right way." That night they checked into another motel, knowing the fight was far from over. The motel was slightly nicer than the last, but the unease hadn't left them. Snoop sat by the window, watching the parking lot. Beverly sat across from him, folding and unfolding the map they had picked up earlier. "You're thinking too much again," she said. "I can't help it." She set the map down and looked at him. "You can't fight everything, Calvin. Sometimes you have to let people step up and fight with you." He hesitated, then nodded. "I just don't want to let them down." "You won't," Beverly said. Before either of them could say more, Snoop's phone buzzed. It was one of his contacts. "We got IDs on the bikers," the voice said. "And you're not going to like what we found." Snoop felt his stomach drop. "What is it?" "They're part of a group that's been linked to several attacks like this. Most of them never made the news. And get this, they've got cops in their pockets." Snoop closed his eyes, the weight of the words settling over him. "Thanks," he said, ending the call. Beverly was already watching him, waiting. "What is it?" He opened his eyes and met hers. "It's bigger than we thought." For the first time, he saw real fear in her expression, but he also saw something else. Determination. "Fight. Then we fight," she said. Snoop nodded. "Yeah, we fight." The night stretched on as they made plans. But Snoop knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The tension was boiling over, and they were right in the middle of it. Tomorrow, the battle would truly begin. The next morning broke under a gray sky, clouds thickening above the horizon like the weight pressing down on Snoop's chest. He stood outside the motel room, leaning against the railing and staring out at the nearly empty parking lot. His phone buzzed in his hand, but he ignored it for now. Too many calls, too many messages. Everyone had an opinion. Lawyers offering advice, reporters requesting interviews, activists reaching out in solidarity. But none of it mattered if the men who had attacked his mother weren't held accountable. Inside the room, Beverly packed her things in silence. She moved slowly, her motions careful and deliberate. Snoop could tell she wasn't herself. The events of the past 2 days had taken their toll. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, stepping back inside. She looked up at him and straightened. "I've been ready my whole life, Calvin. This isn't new to me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. Snoop nodded, though his stomach twisted. He hated seeing her like this. Resilient but worn, she deserved better. His phone buzzed again. This time, he answered. "Yeah, it's me," he said. Marcus, his longtime friend and business associate, was on the other end. "I got the press lined up. They're already sharing the video, but they want to hear your side. I'm talking national coverage, man. This could blow up even bigger." Snoop pinched the bridge of his nose, knowing this was just the beginning. Snoop pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling slowly. "I'm not looking for fame off this, Marcus." "It's not about fame," Marcus replied. "It's about making sure no one forgets what happened. You know how these stories disappear unless we keep pushing." Snoop sighed, knowing he was right. "Set it up." 2 hours later, they were sitting in a downtown law office. The building smelled of fresh paint and polished wood, but it felt sterile, cold, and unwelcoming. Snoop tapped his fingers against the conference table, his eyes scanning the faces of the legal team assembled before him. "These guys aren't just random punks," one of the lawyers said, sliding a file across the table. "They're part of an organized group, connections to white nationalist movements, ties to local authorities. And this isn't their first incident." Beverly leaned forward, her voice steady. "So what happens now?" "We filed charges," the lawyer said. "Assault, harassment, intent to cause bodily harm. But that's just the beginning. The video gives us leverage, but we need to build a stronger case if we want this to stick." Snoop folded his arms. "And what about protection? These guys aren't just going to sit back and let this happen?" The lawyer hesitated. "We'll request additional security measures, but the truth is, we can't guarantee anything. Cases like this tend to get messy." Snoop felt the anger simmering beneath his skin. He knew what that meant. Stalling, excuses, half measures. "Then we make sure it doesn't." Later that evening, they stood in front of a small crowd gathered outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in their faces, and the hum of reporters' voices buzzed through the air. Snoop stepped forward, raising a hand to quiet them. "First, I want to thank everyone for coming out," he began. "But I'm not here to talk about me. This is about my mother. About every mother, father, son, and daughter who's ever had to face hate and violence just for being who they are." The crowd murmured in agreement. Beverly stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm for support. "This isn't just about what happened at that gas station," Snoop continued. "It's about a system that lets people like those bikers think they can get away with it, and it's about making sure that stops today." The applause was loud, but Snoop barely heard it. He was already thinking ahead, about the hearings, the media frenzy, and the backlash that was sure to come. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, interviews, and legal preparations. The weight of it all pressed down on him, but he refused to let it show. Beverly, too, stood strong, though Snoop could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Protests formed outside the courthouse, both in support of their case and against it. Signs bearing hateful messages popped up alongside banners calling for justice. News crews swarmed the area, capturing every moment. One evening, as Snoop and Beverly returned to their motel, they found a note slipped under the door. "Drop the charges, or else." Beverly stared at the paper, her hands trembling slightly. "What does this mean?" Snoop crumpled the note in his fist. "It means they're scared," he said. "And they should be." But he couldn't deny the knot of fear tightening in his gut. He knew these men wouldn't stop. They had already proven that. 2 nights later, someone slashed the tires of their car. The police were called, but the officers who arrived seemed indifferent, jotting down notes without much urgency. "We'll look into it," one of them said before walking away. Beverly sat on the edge of the motel bed, her head in her hands. What if they don't stop, Calvin? What if this just gets worse? Snoop knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Then we keep fighting, no matter what." She looked at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm proud of you, you know that?" He swallowed hard. "I'm proud of you too, Mama." The next day, the legal team filed the charges. The bikers were arrested, though 2 of them made bail almost immediately. The news set off another wave of protests. Snoop knew things were about to get even more complicated, but he also knew they were too far in to back down now. As he and Beverly walked into the courthouse for the first hearing, he squeezed her hand and gave her a reassuring nod. "No matter what happens," he said, "we're in this together." The courthouse loomed ahead like a fortress, its stone walls weathered, its towering columns imposing. Cameras lined the steps, their lenses shifting toward him and Beverly as they approached. Protesters crowded the sidewalks, their voices clashing in a storm of chants, slogans, and shouts. Some held signs demanding justice, while others carried banners filled with hate and resistance. The tension in the air was thick, electric. Snoop adjusted the cuffs of his suit, but his clenched fists betrayed the tension coursing through him. Beside him, Beverly walked with her head high, her expression calm, resolute, and unflinching. She wore a simple dress, understated yet elegant. Despite the weight pressing down on her, she remained poised. As they reached the steps, reporters swarmed them, shouting questions. "Snoop, do you think the charges will stick? Beverly, are you afraid for your safety? And what message do you hope this trial sends?" Snoop ignored them, placing a protective hand on Beverly's back as they made their way inside. He wasn't here for sound bites. He was here for justice. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. The rows of benches were packed. Supporters, journalists, and curious onlookers jostled for position. At the defense table, the bikers sat stiffly, their leather jackets replaced with ill-fitting suits. They looked uncomfortable, out of place, but their eyes still carried the same defiance. Snoop's gaze locked onto one of them, the tall one who had started the fight at the gas station. The man smirked, a silent challenge. Snoop felt his anger rise, but Beverly's hand on his arm grounded him. "Stay focused," she whispered. He nodded. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "This court is now in session." The prosecution wasted no time. The screen flickered to life, displaying the video footage. It showed the bikers surrounding Beverly, their words sharp, their aggression clear. Gasps rippled through the room as the scene escalated, culminating in the physical assault and Snoop's intervention. The prosecutor let the silence linger before addressing the jury. "This is not an isolated incident," she said. "This is part of a pattern of intimidation, harassment, and violence. And today we are here to put an end to it." The defense countered swiftly. "Amy felt threatened," the defense attorney argued, pacing in front of the jury. "They were outnumbered and feared for their safety. This was not a hate crime. It was a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control." Snoop's blood boiled, but he kept his composure. He knew this was coming. He knew they would try to twist the truth. But he was ready. Witnesses took the stand one by one. The gas station clerk described what he had seen, the bikers surrounding Beverly, their aggressive posture, and Snoop stepping in to protect her. But under cross-examination, the defense worked hard to chip away at his credibility. They pointed out minor inconsistencies in his account, subtly implying that he may have been biased due to Snoop's celebrity status. The strategy was clear: cast doubt, create confusion, and weaken the prosecution's case. Then Beverly took the stand. She spoke with a calmness that silenced the room. Her voice was steady as she recounted the fear she had felt, but also her determination not to back down. "They didn't see me as a person," she said, her gaze sweeping across the jury. "They saw me as something less, and that's why we're here today." The defense attempted to rattle her, questioning her memory and motives, but Beverly did not flinch. When they suggested she had exaggerated the threat, she looked the lawyer straight in the eye and asked, "Would you have done the same if it was your mother?" The question hung in the air. The lawyer hesitated, unable to form a response. The impact was undeniable. Finally, it was Snoop's turn to take the stand. He spoke openly about his upbringing, the struggles his mother faced while raising him, and the lessons she had taught him about standing up for what's right. "I didn't want to fight," he said, his voice firm. "I wanted to protect my mother, and I'd do it again if I had to." The defense wasted no time attempting to paint him as aggressive. They brought up lyrics from his past songs, implying that his music encouraged violence, and questioned whether his fame had influenced his actions that night. Snoop didn't waver. "I make music about the world I grew up in," he said, "and that world didn't change just because I got famous." As the trial progressed, tensions outside the courthouse grew. Protesters clashed, police struggled to maintain control, and threats poured in online. Beverly refused to be intimidated. She continued speaking to the press, sharing her story, and calling for change. "This isn't just about us," she said in an interview. It's about everyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this. Her words resonated. Support grew. Celebrities, activists, and politicians spoke out, adding to the pressure. But the bikers' supporters fought back just as hard, spreading misinformation, twisting the narrative, and trying to discredit Beverly and Snoop. The weight of it all bore down on Snoop, but he refused to let it break him. The closing arguments were a battle of ideals. The prosecution emphasized the evidence, the video, the testimonies, the history of the bikers group. "This is not just about one night," the prosecutor said, her voice unwavering. "It's about the kind of world we want to live in. Do we let hate and fear win, or do we stand up and say, 'No more'?" The defense leaned on fear. "These men are not monsters," the defense attorney argued. "They made a mistake. Don't let one moment define their lives." Snoop clenched his fists. A mistake. That was all it was to them. The jury deliberated for hours. Every second felt like an eternity. Snoop paced the waiting room while Beverly sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "You think they'll see the truth?" she asked. "Them they have to," Snoop replied. But even he wasn't sure if he believed it. Finally, they were called back in. The jury had reached a verdict. The room was silent as the foreman stood and read the decision. "On the charge of assault, we find the defendants guilty." A wave of relief washed over Snoop, but he didn't celebrate. Not yet. The judge handed down the sentence. Prison time for some, mandatory community service, and anti-bass training for others. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step forward. As they left the courtroom, Snoop took Beverly's hand. "It's not over," he said. "No," she agreed, squeezing his hand. "But it's a start." As they walked down the courthouse steps, past the cameras and the thinning crowds, Snoop felt something he hadn't felt in days. Hope. The courthouse steps were quieter now. The reporters had dispersed. The protesters had gone home. The roar of the crowd had faded into memory. But the fight wasn't over, and Snoop wasn't done. Beverly and Snoop stood at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out over the now empty plaza. The trial was over. The verdict had been read. Justice in some form had been served. But neither of them felt like celebrating. The weight of the last few weeks still pressed down on them, the sleepless nights, the threats, the endless questions. It had all left scars that wouldn't heal overnight. Beverly gripped Snoop's arm as they made their way down the steps, her pace steady but slow. "You sure you're okay, Mama?" Snoop asked, his voice soft. She looked up at him and gave a faint smile. "I'm tired, Calvin, but I'm okay." It was a simple answer, but Snoop heard the exhaustion behind it. This fight had taken a toll on her, on both of them, and yet there was something else in her voice, a quiet strength that hadn't been broken. As they reached the car, Snoop paused, glancing back at the courthouse one last time. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a symbol of everything they had endured, and everything they still had to fight for. "This ain't the end," he said, more to himself than to Beverly. "No," she agreed. "It's just the beginning." The next few weeks passed in a blur of interviews, meetings, and planning sessions. The case had ignited a national conversation, and Snoop was determined to keep the momentum going. He knew the verdict wasn't enough. Real change required more than a single courtroom victory. He reached out to community leaders, activists, and educators. Together, they began drafting proposals for new initiatives, programs aimed at addressing racism, promoting tolerance, and educating young people about equality and justice. Beverly was right there with him. She spoke at town halls and schools, sharing her story and encouraging others to speak out against hate. Her voice became a rallying cry for change, and people listened. One afternoon, they stood outside a community center in South Los Angeles, watching as volunteers set up tables and booths for a neighborhood event. Kids ran through the parking lot, their laughter echoing off the walls. Parents chatted in small groups, some holding signs that read, "Unity over hate." Beverly smiled, watching the scene unfold. "This," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "This is what it's all about." As Beverly watched the scene unfold, she smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Snoop nodded. "Yeah, but this is just the start." Their first program focused on education. Partnering with local schools, they developed workshops and seminars to teach students about the history of racism in America and the importance of empathy and inclusion. Beverly insisted on being involved in every step, sharing her own experiences and encouraging students to open up about theirs. At one session, a young girl raised her hand and asked, "How do you stay so strong?" Beverly smiled gently. "It's not about never being scared," she said. "It's about what you do with that fear. You can let it stop you, or you can let it push you to do something good." The girl nodded, her eyes shining with determination. But not everyone welcomed the changes. Protests erupted outside some events, angry voices accusing them of stirring up trouble and dividing the country. Threatening messages poured in, some targeting Snoop, others aimed at Beverly. Snoop refused to back down. He increased security at their events and kept pushing forward. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. Late one night, he sat in his office, scrolling through messages and news updates. Beverly walked in carrying 2 cups of tea. "You need to rest," she said, setting one down in front of him. "I can't," he replied. "Not yet." She sat across from him, watching him closely. "You're not going to fix everything overnight, Calvin. Change takes time." "I know," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But what if it's not enough? What if—" Beverly cut him off with a knowing look. "Look at what you've already done. Look at what we've done. That's more than enough to keep going." Snoop stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "You're right," she smiled. "I usually am." 6 months later, they reached their next milestone, the grand opening of the Justice and Unity Center in Los Angeles. The converted warehouse had been transformed into a space for workshops, counseling, and community meetings. Murals covered the walls, bold images of unity, strength, and hope that reflected their vision for change. At the grand opening, Snoop stood at the podium, surveying the gathered crowd. Beverly stood beside him, her presence grounding him as always, reminding him of their journey's purpose. "This center isn't just a building," Snoop declared. "It's a promise that we're not going to let hate win, not here, not anywhere." The applause was deafening, but Snoop barely heard it, his mind already focused on the next steps, new cities, new programs, and the challenges ahead. The applause was deafening, but Snoop barely heard it. His mind was already on the next step, the next city, the next program. Over time, the center evolved beyond its physical walls. It became a symbol of hope and transformation, drawing people from across the country to learn, share, and find their voice. The programs expanded into schools, prisons, and corporations, while support from celebrities and politicians helped the movement grow stronger each day. At the heart of it all was Beverly, whose quiet strength became a beacon for young activists. One day, as she and Snoop walked through the center, she paused before a mural of a tree with deep, intertwining roots. "Look at this," she said, pointing to it. "That's what we're building here." Roots. Something that lasts. Snoop smiled, recognizing the truth in her words. "You're right again, Mama." Years later, at a rally in Washington, D.C., Snoop took the stage while Beverly sat in the front row. Though her hair had grayed, her eyes remained sharp as ever, still burning with the same determination that had carried them through that night at the gas station. As he addressed the massive crowd, memories of that pivotal moment flooded back. The fear, the anger, and the unwavering resolve to fight back. "We started this because we had to," he told the crowd, his voice carrying across the gathered thousands. "But we kept going because we knew we weren't alone, and we're not done yet." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Snoop's gaze found Beverly. She smiled up at him, her pride radiating brighter than ever. In that moment, surrounded by the faces of those they had helped, he knew with certainty their fight had already changed the world, one heart, one community at a time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family, and check out our other stories for more powerful and thought-provoking content.